With this fail fast and grow fast thinking, I would like to move towards Pawan and ask about very simple question. We often say that a lot of companies, whoever is raising money is raising because of innovation, and innovation is the driving force in most of the tech startups right now. How does design thinking play a critical role when the innovations or the product or the MVPs are failing in the market?
Yeah, so I think let me take this question with some data. Okay, and I was
Okay.
as looking at a presentation. So
Mhm.
let me share my screen. Okay. Since we talk of intellectual property, and I thought it useful to do justice to the day and talk about intellectual property as well. So on your screen, you see this is the ranking of the world's most innovative companies. And this has been produced by BCG, Boston Consulting Group,
Yeah.
since 2004. They have been coming up with this ranking of the world's most innovative companies. Now, how do they come up with this ranking? So they survey close to 1,500 C-suite executives. They look at their 5-year performance in terms of returns on capital, returns on equity, net scores in terms of profitable growth, etc. And then they also weigh in terms of the most innovative companies in the peer group. What stands out in this list is number one, there is not even a single Indian company in the world's most 50 most innovative organizations. Number two,
Right.
there are a lot of old companies. Every column has a company which is more than a century old.
Mhm.
This is interesting. We often associate innovation with startup world, startup community, or the companies which are tech intensive like Google, Facebook, etc. But if you look at every single column, in column one, you have an IBM, which is more than 110-year-old company. Column two have DuPont and Siemens, which is collectively each 150-year-old company. Philips
Yeah.
is 150-year-old company. You have a Marriott also, which is a hotel, McDonald's, Unilever. Then you have 3M, which is a reasonably old company, 100-year-old plus. And Rio Tinto is a mining company, which means that innovation is nothing to do with startups. So we need to really take this myth out that because we are a startup organization, we have the sort of right to be innovative and the large enterprises are not, which is not true. The second view is R&D spending. This is the world's 20 most heavily R&D spenders in the world. Right at the top is Amazon. Amazon spends $22.6 billion per year on R&D alone. So in 2012, they spent 6% of their annual revenues on R&D, which is what we call as R&D intensity, which went doubled in the next 6 years, is at 12.7%, which is to say that Amazon spent more on R&D than the largest pharmaceutical company in the world. If you look at the pecking order, you have Amazon, Alphabet, Volkswagen, Siemens, etc. And if you really go through this list a bit on detail, you would realize only two types of companies are there in the list, or say three: pharma, auto, and tech. The
Tech.
only exception, if you may, of course, the auto is you have Honda, Daimler, General Motors, etc., Toyota. But the company which is the least R&D intensity is, if you look at the last but one column, we call this is R&D intensity. And the company which is the least R&D intensity, which is the R&D as a percentage of your revenues, is a company by the name, which is the company here, which is the least R&D intensity. Look at the 2018 column of R&D intensity.
Mhm. That's
Let me just highlight that column for all of you.
Daimler.
Which is the company which is the least R&D
Daimler.
intensity? No,
Daimler.
least R&D
Um,
intensity.
Six.
3.6. Yeah, that's a Daimler,
Yeah.
least R&D
Daimler.
intensity. And the highest R&D intensity is Intel at 20%. Now, if I ask people to identify the most important products which have come from Amazon, they would really struggle to go beyond an Alexa or a Kindle or a Fire
Absolutely.
TV stick or Amazon.com, which means Amazon spends a lot of R&D in supply chain management, customer relationship management, logistics. That means that innovation doesn't have to be about products, about things that the end customer tends to see. The third is patents. These are the world's largest patent granted companies. Granted, okay, not filed, as of US Patent and
Yeah.
Trademark Office. That's something which is close to the day's calling. Right at the top is IBM, which has been the number one in terms of patent granted for the last 25 years, 27 years actually. 92 they started the whole thing. At 9,000 patents, IBM has more number of patents granted than India as a country. Okay, and I thought I'll put this in perspective today. India as a country do not have 9,000 patents filed, let alone granted in a given year, and IBM on the other hand gets so many. The more interesting thing is to put these three things in perspective. Most innovative companies, companies which is the highest R&D spending, and the companies which have the highest patents. Now, and this is something which bursts a few myths. What
Absolutely.
matters? What would really matter is if the patents translate into innovation. If R&D translates into patents and patents translates into innovation. But if you really go through this list very carefully, and I would advise you to, is which names are common, and you would really struggle to find the common names. As a matter of fact, only 5 names are common. There are only 5 companies in the world that do a very high R&D intensity, very high spending on R&D, goes on to file patents, get the patent granted, and also goes on to commercialize the patents. So my parting message to all of you, and since I'm no expert on startup funding, and that's why I kept quiet because that's not an area of expertise for me at all. I never raised funds. I never sold anything, which I don't intend to also. But the intent is you need to commercialize your ideas. A tremendous amount of focus in the startup community goes into getting ideas, filing patents, protecting your patents. As a matter of fact, in the year 2010, Apple had spent more money on lawyers than on scientists, which is very surprising. Apple and Google, both of these companies, had more money spent on lawyers to fight for what they filed than to actually file at the first place. So the real currency is not patents. The real currency is not so much intellectual property. You need to have intellectual property. I don't deny that. But the real currency is your ability to put intellectual property into the market and get the customer to pay for it. And that's why design thinking comes into picture. Design thinking, instead of starting with what unique idea you have, instead of starting with what technology you have, design thinking goes backwards. It starts with who's the customer and what's the unique need the customer has. And then you trace back that do you really require that kind of a technology, or all you need to do is to copy. And many times I strongly advocate startups that instead of trying to innovate, start by copying. A
Mhm.
far higher probability of success will come to you if you start copying, and if need be, innovate. I think somehow we have been dismissive of the word copy, imitation. But if you look at countries after countries, I'm not even talking of companies, countries after countries have really established themselves strongly by the virtue of imitation. So that's where design thinking plays a role so much, not in invention or intellectual property, but in sweating that intellectual property so that you get money. And that's what 3M does very beautifully. The way 3M defines innovation is as follows. 3M says research is about converting money into knowledge. Research is about converting money into knowledge, and innovation is about converting knowledge into money. So, a good company has to have this virtuous loop where they are feeding money to get knowledge, but at the same time, more importantly, ensuring that whatever they know, instead of protecting what they know, they start sweating it out. So, that's my view.